Okay, we are online. So welcome you all to Light Talk 04, Gender Smart Climate, and this also risk investing and grant making from principles to practice. This Light Talk is organized and promoted by FAMD and the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership within their framework of their engagement together with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Before we get started, I just want to quickly go over some housekeeping rules. First of all, this webinar is recorded and will be available soon online on our channels. At the end, we'll have a quick session to address some questions from the floor, but you are more than free to put your question throughout the whole session into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to get around to everyone. In the chat box, you may also find some relevant links, contents where to find the recording, and other relevant information that we are talking about. Now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Jana for a welcome to this Light Talk, but thank you again for joining us today. So please, Jana, the floor is yours. Thanks, over.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you to all the participants today. Welcome also from my side, from the Ensure Resilience Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions. My name is Jana Siebenegg from the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership Secretariat. So we have been organizing this live talk series together with FAMD, who support the facilitation. So thank you to that. And thank you also for Catherine Miles, who will moderate the whole session today and who wrote the foundational guidance note, the step-by-step guidance on how to do gender lens investing and grant making. And thank you also to the panel of speakers. I'm really excited to listen to you, so I will keep my welcoming remarks short, so I don't take time from you. And I also see like more and more participants coming in, so that's really great. So in the live talk series, we cover a broad range of topics that concern gender and climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. For example, we had a live talk last year on how to monitor and evaluate gender responsive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, short Cdrfi. And we will have another live talk also coming up in October. I'm really excited on poverty-related barriers to accessing Cdrfi. Based on or with a special focus on women, poor women. And just to give you a short background, so the Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions is a knowledge sharing platform that is hosted under the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership. And we are co-financed by the German ministry BMZ and Global Affairs Canada. So together with those co-financing partners, we can actually establish a lot of activities together with our Ensure Resilience Gender Working Group. We are filling this platform with live. They are gender champions from all over the world, from all sectors that contribute with knowledge products for policymakers and practitioners, with case studies, with opportunities. So you are also very welcome to engage with us, to share your products with us, to share your webinars or whatever you're working on in the field of Cdrfi. And among others, we commission like those step-by-step guidance, as Catherine will speak about today. We commission analytical studies. We organize events like these. We take part in relevant climate change events, and we also provide scholarships to high potential women leaders. So please contact us if you want to share something with us, or get in touch or become member of the Gender Working Group. Thank you. And I'm super delighted to give the word to our Gender Working Group co-chair and co-financier from Global Affairs Canada, Christine Martel-Fleming. Thank you, Christine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Martel-Fleming, and on behalf of Global Affairs Canada's Environment Division, I'm really excited to welcome you to this webinar on gender smart climate and disaster risk investing and grant making from principles to practice. And as Jana said, together with CARE International, Global Affairs Canada represented by myself, co-chairs the INSU Resilience Gender Working Group. And this is a group that consists of 28 members who are working collaboratively towards the aim of integrating gender responsive and sensitive approaches as a cross-cutting topic in the partnership's vision. So as you may or may not know, in September 2020, the INSU Resilience High-Level Consultative Group endorsed an INSU Resilience Declaration on Gender. And this declaration really aims to highlight the importance of gender responsive approaches to climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, or Cdrfi, as we refer to it, in order to realize the Vision 2025, which aims to provide 500 million poor and vulnerable people with prearranged risk finance and insurance solutions against the impacts of climate and disaster shocks. It also calls on members of the partnership to incorporate gender lens grant allocation investment criteria into the program alliance funding mechanisms for Cdrfi, but also for other relevant programs. And in alignment with this, I'm pleased to say that the Government of Canada really supports gender lens investing as a way to influence systems of finance. As you know, we really see this as being integral to addressing systemic barriers to gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in developing countries. So in this context, Global Affairs Canada has a commitment to both gender lens investing more broadly, but also specifically related to climate and disaster risk finance. So for example, this year in partnership with Convergence, we launched a gender responsive climate finance window in December 2021. And this will award early stage grant funding for the design and launch of innovative blended finance vehicles focused on both the intersection of climate change and gender equality in emerging markets globally. And this window overall aims to really build the field by supporting a pipeline of gender climate blended finance vehicles. And of course, I'm pleased to say that we'll hear more about this later on. It also builds on our wider focus of gender lens investing within the framework of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy to advance gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls across all of our programming. But within the Government of Canada, there are also other institutions that are contributing to this work. As an example, FinDev Canada, or the Development Finance Institute Canada, which works to provide easier access to capital for entrepreneurs in developing markets by delivering innovative financial solutions to businesses that also have the potential impact of creating jobs, empowering women, and also advancing climate change mitigation and adaptation. FinDev Canada is also a member of 2X Collaborative, which some of you may know here, an international group of gender-focused investors. And is also a founding member of the 2X Challenge, launched at the G7 Summit actually in 2018 to inspire development finance institutions, international finance institutions, and the broader private sector to really invest in the world's women. So the 2X Challenge actually initially called for the G7 and other development finance institutions and the private sector to collectively mobilize $3 billion US in commitments from 2018 to 2020 to provide women in developing country markets with improved access to leadership opportunities, quality employment, finance, enterprise support, and products and services that can really enhance their economic participation and access. But I'm pleased to say that it's actually resulted in 11.4 billion US in committed and mobilized capital for women's economic empowerment. And it's also led to the development of a standard set of criteria to help guide investors to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. And we'll also hear more about this today from one of our panelists. So with that, I really look forward to the discussion and to hearing from all of our panelists today on this theme. And I'd like to call on Catherine Miles, our facilitator, to provide an overview of today's agenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome everyone. So today we're going to be celebrating the launch of the Insure Resilience step-by-step guidance, Gender Lens Investing in Climate and Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Solutions. It's just published today. It's on the website and you can access it via Twitter, and there's a Twitter handle which is shown on the screen at the moment. Now, as has been mentioned, this is the latest in our series of how-to guides, and it's specifically focusing on the deployment of development finance with a gender lens in Cdrfi related investment and grant making opportunities. We're going to be hearing this term Cdrfi quite a lot today. I know it's a jargon and it's a bit of a mouthful, but that means climate and disaster risk financing and insurance. So in terms of the webinar agenda, we're going to be sharing insights from this new publication. We're also going to be exploring the business case for gender smart investing and grant making within Cdrfi programs, and also sharing existing approaches where there are gaps and challenges and opportunities to really enhance gender smart investments and grant making within this type of programming. In terms of our agenda, we're going to get an input from yourselves very shortly, and then I'm going to give you a very brief introduction on some of the basics. Now, I think some of you will already know a little bit about the topic, but for those that don't, that will give you an overview, and then we'll have two panel discussions. The first on the investment case from the DFI perspective, and then we'll have a second session after a second participant input, and that will be looking at the practice, the operationalization of these commitments in practice. Now, during these sessions, as has been said, you're encouraged to be providing insights and inputs via the chat function, so don't forget to do that. We're welcoming a range of highly esteemed speakers here today, and we'll do a proper introduction shortly. But before we start, what I'm going to do is hand over to Sylvia from PharmD, and she's going to ask you all a question about the topic. So Sylvia, we're asking the question, what is gender lens investing in Cdrfi solutions from the perspective of participants? So over to you. I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going over to Mentimeter.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Thanks so much for introducing this question to our participants. And now I'm going to share and launch the question. So indeed, the question is, what is gender lens investing in climate and disaster risk financing and insurance? So today we'll be using a Mentimeter platform to generate a workload of insight. Just for those who are not familiar with it, please, you have to use your web browsers to navigate from your laptop or smartphone to the Mentimeter website and input the code that you are now seeing on the top of the screen. And now also copying the code in the chat. And you will have 2 minutes to vote to the question. So just okay, sorry. Okay, from now you have 2 minutes to vote. So let's say tricky. These are the first answers coming up from our audience. The opportunity. So let's see which are your ideas lacking. Okay. It means women leadership. Okay, that sounds interesting. Good to see that we have so much engagement. Okay, so a few seconds to input your ideas into Mentimeter. Integration, inclusion, data informed, complicated, that sounds funny. Necessary, I guess, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the time is almost up. Participation the equity, minimize losses. So many answers we collect from this first question. And now the time is up, so I have to close here the answer session, but I want to thank you for answering this first question. And now I will stop sharing and I will pass back the floor to Catherine for representation, the basics of the gender smart investing in Cdrfi. So thank you, Catherine, and the floor is yours again. Thanks, over.
Thank you very much. So we were starting to get closer to some definitions there, just in terms of some key words about what we mean by gender lens investing in climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. And we saw terms such as women's leadership and financial access popping up there, but also the complexity of it. So what do we actually mean by this? I'm going to just spend a few moments setting out the context, and the information that's shared here is in the publication, so please refer to that as well. So it's useful really to start with a definition of climate finance. There's really no formally agreed definition of that, but what it actually means is investing as climate smart investing is around directing public, private or development sectors financing to activities or organisations which directly support climate change mitigation or adaptation alongside bringing financial returns. So within that framework, when we're talking about gender smart climate finance or applying a gender lens, as some people say, to climate finance, it's about bringing together that gender and climate lens together, not in just what we're investing in, but who, how, and into companies as well as funds and financial institutions. Drawing on this in our guidance note, we propose going sort of drilling down a bit further, because Cdrfi is a subset of climate finance, and so we're defining as investing in Cdrfi solutions, which involves incorporating a gender analysis and the process of directing these Cdrfi investments in grants in activities or organisations which support climate and disaster resilience building and risk protection. And I think we saw risk protection was one of the words that popped up on the screen a moment ago as well. So in terms of these overlapping fields, just to highlight that gender lens investing in Cdrfi solutions really is this subset of gender smart climate finance, which is lying at this nexus of gender finance and climate finance. And within this broader framework, there's really a growing commitment from different types of investors to apply this gender lens to climate finance, and also a climate lens to gender finance, as it's often referred. And this is within the wider context where we're seeing growing interest in what is called gender lens investing or gender smart investing. Now, the G7 and the DFIs, including members of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, have created a specific aim, which was referred to by Christine earlier on, to empower women through investment, and they've collectively mobilised this 11.4 billion for gender lens investing through the 2X Challenge initiative, which we're going to be hearing about more shortly. So there's a real driver there, and I think we'll hear a bit more about the business case for that shortly. So what do we mean, though, in terms of sort of going away from the definitions to sort of the how this is done? So there are a range of different gender lens, what we call entry points to Cdrfi investors and grant makers. And the way that we frame these are in terms of the investment policy strategy and maybe an action plan, which is incorporating this real intentional gender focus in the allocation of capital to Cdrfi. We also see an entry point in terms of the investment and grant making process itself. So this isn't the strategy, this is just more the how you go about it at each stage of that process, and we'll break down what that process is in a moment. But then thirdly, we're looking at a main entry point as being looking internally within the organisation itself that is doing that investment and grant making, and looking at internal gender diversity there. So really, to elaborate on this first point, the investment policy strategy and action plan. So you may apply one or more gender lenses or strategies, but as an investor or a grant maker who's focused on Cdrfi, and this may be intentionally in your investments across different types of asset classes, whether public and private capital. Now, this investment strategy might be incorporated into a specific investment or fund or grant funding window if you're providing grants, but it also could be across your entire investment or grant making portfolio. Now, in our framing in the publication, what you'll see, we've adapted the commonly applied gender lenses to the field of Cdrfi, and these lenses including looking at Cdrfi businesses or solutions that are led by women, provide solutions, these Cdrfi solutions that are intentionally designed to close the protection gap, the financial protection gap, and address gender-specific climate and disaster-related vulnerabilities. There's also the lens around gender diversity in the workforce, and also focusing these investments towards women-led businesses in the Cdrfi business value chain. And so the application of these strategies and one or more of these lenses may or may not be documented formally in a gender policy or strategy or in an action plan, but it's around sort of what is your focus and when you're making those decisions in what you're investing in. So then turning to the second entry point, here, this diagram is really just to show that gender dynamics are all pervasive. There are gender impacts across the whole of the process, from identifying your opportunities of who you're going to be investing in, doing your due diligence on that process, the actual decision making itself, the contracting, and also afterwards in how you provide technical assistance, and the kinds of information that you're gathering data on to track performance. So, you know, gender lens investing also involves integrating gender considerations across the whole of these different stages in the process, as well as in the strategy itself. So that is another way that you can consider gender lens investing in Cdrfi. Then there's also the third entry point that we referred to, which is around sort of within the organisation itself, as an investor. Again, gender dynamics are all pervasive, so whatever actions you take, the policies you have as an organisation, they all have gender impacts, and are impacts also by the wider gender context that you're operating in that wider investment and grant making ecosystem. And so the investment firm itself can impact on its own workforce, resulting in from its own organisational practices. So if we're thinking about gender lens investing in Cdrfi solutions, it also is around addressing the gender diversity within the investment firm that's making that decision making around the investments or grants. So yeah, it can relate to promoting gender equity and equality through organisational policies and practices related to the leadership in the workforce, the operations, and also for instance, whether or not you have parental leave policies, flexible working, and looking at women's participation at all levels in the organisation. So there are different gender entry points. So what you'll see in the guidance that we've got here today that's been published is we're setting out a series of questions to really make you think about how you're going about your Cdrfi investing and grant making, and seeing whether or not you're intentionally or otherwise integrating a gender lens at each of these overarching entry points, but also within that different parts of each of those processes. And so what you can see on the screen here is some of the areas where you may be or may not be considering at the moment gender considerations as you're allocating capital and undertaking this practice and the process, and also looking internally within your own organisation. So we'll be exploring some of these very concrete points shortly with some of our speakers, and we've got some case studies in the guidance note itself, but we're elaborating further on them in the interventions via the panelists in a moment. So this is really just a very whistle-top tour, as it were, of some of the very, very basics. And to find out more, I really encourage you to read the guidance. But as I say, we're going to be exploring some of these points in more detail now with our first session. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the first panel session. And in this session, we're looking at the investment case for gender smart investing. And we're considering the different motivations and approaches for applying a gender lens in climate financing more broadly, and in Cdrfi investments, to really understand the case from a development finance perspective. So I'm really happy that we've got Young-Hee Lee from the Adaptation Fund with us today, and Marianne Wiesmar from the 2X Collaborative. So we're going to bring them on to the screen now, and if you can unmute yourselves, we'll start. I think we're going to stop sharing the screen so you can see the speakers now, and we're going to learn from our panelists. So really, maybe Young, we'll start with you today, and thank you for joining us. So from the perspective of the Adaptation Fund, you're really a pioneer in climate adaptation finance. So what's really the main motivation for yourselves at the Adaptation Fund to apply a gender consideration in climate financing, and how do you do this?
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to join this event, and also once again, congratulations on the launch of the Insure Resilience Step-by-Step Gender Guidance. So if I can start with a brief introduction of the Adaptation Fund, those who are not familiar, the fund was created in 2001 under the UNFCCC Kyoto Protocol, and is the first international climate fund dedicated to financing concrete adaptation projects for vulnerable communities in developing countries. The Adaptation Fund early recognized that gender equality is a key and necessary foundation for more effective, sustainable, and equitable climate adaptation actions, and has integrated gender considerations throughout its operations and funding projects since 2013. The fund's gender mandate can be broadly categorized into two. First is a do no harm approach through the fund's environmental and social policy. And second, do something good approach under the fund's gender policy and gender action plan by proactively addressing gender equality and women's empowerment. Fund adopted its own gender policy in 2016 and further updated in 2021, elevating its ambition and goal for gender equality, such as by applying intersectional analysis to better understand and address multi-layered complexities of gendered vulnerabilities, systematic barriers to opportunities, and root causes of inequality, and build more responsive and tailored gender interventions. So under the fund's gender policy and gender action plan, gender considerations is required to be integrated throughout the project lifecycle, from design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. In the Adaptation Fund, project proposals without sufficient articulation of gender considerations cannot be approved by the Adaptation Fund's board. So a meaningful and inclusive and gender responsive stakeholder consultations is another requirement, and gender assessment is mandatory for project proposal, and the results of the gender assessment should inform the gender responsive project interventions. Establishing gender desegregated indicators and gender responsive monitoring and evaluation framework are critical for collecting data relevant to social and economic components of the projects, as well as for measuring gender progress. We also underline the need of application of intersectional analysis and encourages our implementing entities to identify these groups and adopt concrete measures aimed at overcoming barriers for their empowerment and resilience. In addition, the fund has also expanded access to financial resources, not only for accredited implementing entities, but also non-accredited entities through enhanced direct access funding window and small innovation grants via an innovation facility. In that regard, we have encouraged vulnerable communities, local women's groups to access funding through such windows when direct access or accreditation with the Adaptation Fund is not immediately possible or suitable for them. Fund is also developing its gender scorecard to enhance tracking and capturing of gender progress in Adaptation Fund's portfolio. We have emphasized achieving the goal of gender equality can be achieved through concerted efforts, and therefore encouraged all the Adaptation Fund stakeholders to serve as a gender champion. So let me stop there, Catherine. Thank you. You're muted.
So it's really concrete steps that you've been taking to really operationalize your policy and moving away from that no harm approach to the proactive approach, which I think is fantastic to see, and really and moving also towards incorporating this intersectionality concept, which we're hearing more and more. How though, given you've got such a wide range of practices and you know, both your own practice and what you're encouraging those you're investing in to do, how are you working to disseminate these good practices amongst the and encouraging these good practices among the recipients of your funding? And are there any trends that you're seeing over time in terms of kind of practices that they're picking up from the experiences?
Sure, Ken. Very good question. So the fund has tried to strengthen the gender responsive knowledge management and also the knowledge sharing through producing gender responsive knowledge products, also producing gender guidance materials, and also e-learning courses for our implementing entities to guide them on how to comply with the fund's gender policy and action plan throughout their project life cycle. If I may share some good examples of the gender responsive measures in our project. For example, in Peru, a project is reducing gender gaps in natural resource management through sustainable ecotourism, business management, trade and fishery byproducts to foster leadership roles for women and create alternative livelihoods. In Morocco, a project is responding to drought by restoring indigenous underground water canals and supporting product diversification through women's associations. About 400 women have been trained in conservation techniques, innovative adaptation measures, designing and financing projects. Over time, we have witnessed gender progress in our portfolio. Some best gender practices include promoting the active participation of women in decision-making bodies within the projects, communities, and groups. Training project staff on gender issues has proven to be an important tool to generate knowledge, develop skills, and raise awareness on the why and how to mainstream gender. Raising awareness and building capacity among national and local stakeholders on the impacts of climate change and cross-cutting gender dynamics strengthened efforts to implement appropriate responses to threats and threats of the targeted populations. Also, last but not least, like broad stakeholder engagement encouraged participation of often marginalized groups and a gender balance of community participants, participants, which in turn provides diverse input in issues, perspectives, and leadership skills, contributing to ownership and the project and sustainable outputs.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. And I think what we're seeing here is actually a lot of the practices you're implementing are not actually specific to kind of good practices for climate finance and gender lens investing, or indeed Cdrfi gender lens investing, but these are just generic good practices if you're applying a gender lens to your investments. Maybe actually with that and building on some of what we're hearing your practices are, maybe we turn to Marijn now. And Marijn, you're a convener and a standard setter from the 2X Collaborative, and so from your perspective, why should DFIs be integrating Cdrfi, those that are investing in climate finance or Cdrfi, but also more generally, why should they be integrating gender considerations in their investment and grant making? And how have you been building this case at 2X, please?
Thank you, Catherine, and really happy with the report that you published, as it builds on all the good work that is being done by Gender Smart, by the 2X Collaborative. And so, to your question, why should DFIs invest in, shall we first say climate finance? I think that makes a lot of sense. I think all finance has to become climate finance. And what we are trying to to do by building in a gender lens is try not to perpetuate the inequality that we have in our current financial system, but to really build in a gender, but broader than that, a gender and diversity lens into climate finance. It makes a lot of sense. I think there are two good reasons. One is women are disproportionately affected by climate change, but not to always put women in the victim position. Women are also a disproportionate part of the solution. And so they're disproportionately vulnerable because of the jobs they have, because of the places they live in, because of the work they do, but disproportionate part of the solution because of their communication style, their negotiation style, I'm generalizing, but the willingness to collaborate, co-create, do big and long-term thinking, and all these capabilities are much needed to in climate finance also, and to solve some of the big problems that we see.
So we're seeing.
So to your point, how are we doing this? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, you're seeing, well, because Cdrfi and gender lens investing is really at the nascent stage, I think really what's interesting to hear from you is, as a convener of diverse different organisations that are focused on this agenda, what are the lessons learned through 2X Challenge and the collaborative about how what we should be doing as Cdrfi investors to really accelerate the practices that we're hearing about, to take advantage of these opportunities it presents, and the impact, the positive gender impact? What do we need to do?
So I think we just heard a good example, from the Adaptation Fund. I think so. What they are doing is just plain good business. I think integrating these considerations into your investment process and your risk analysis, and just asking the questions: where is the money going? What percentage is going to climate finance? Where are the women? Where are the women in leadership? Where are the women in the products and services? Where are the women in the value chain? What is the percentage of women ownership? So it is, and that is only just the beginning, because that's the plain counting. Now you have the facts, and then you know what you need to be changing going forward. So I think that would be my simple answer. It's start doing it, and I think we can learn, let's say, from the whole ESG journey. In the beginning, bankers were and financiers and insurance companies were like, "What? What does that have to do with us?" Well, a lot. I think there's no more debate these days, and it is built into all our considerations when making investment decisions and insurance decisions. And so I think for climate and gender, the same route will be followed. I'm quite confident.
And you touched just on the measurement. What role do you see then in terms of improving the measurement of the impact of gender lens investing in climate finance? Just sort of 1 minute kind of response, very high level. I think you've got a framework, right, that we can use. We can.
I was going to say then, if you want a minute response, Catherine, then I would, we can share that in the chat window. I would prefer people to have a look at the 2X Green Toolkit. It brings the nexus between climate and gender together for investors. And we are working on a set of due diligence questionnaires also to really take you by the hand as investor on a couple of themes and a couple of sectors. We can share the chat window, and then in the chat window, and then I can shut up now.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing. And I know if there's a lot of information we can get from 2X Collaborative, so really any questions to Marijn if you have any. Back to you, Young. One final question from yourself. You mentioned this program module, capacity building support that you provide, this e-learning course. Is that available? Can people online find that and come to you for further information to participate in that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Catherine. While promoting awareness on the importance of gender considerations to integrate into to the Adaptation Fund projects through the fund's readiness workshops and other gender-related events, the fund has also provided financial support of readiness grants for gender to help our implementing entities to build and strengthen gender capacity. So under readiness program, the technical assistance grants for the environmental and social policy and gender policy, as well as technical assistance grant dedicated for gender capacity building, as well as project formulation grants are available to support the required gender integration into the projects. We have also produced a number of gender-related knowledge products to support continued learning and sharing of experiences related to advancing gender-responsive approach. For example, we have published recently a study on intersectional approaches to gender mainstreaming in adaptation relevant interventions, which shows that updated analysis of changing dynamics of gender and intersectional approaches can help better understand and address nuanced vulnerabilities and capacity of women and girls, men and boys, and non-binary people, and build more responsive, tailored gender interventions, which will lead to more inclusive, effective, and sustainable adaptation outcomes and impacts. Another example is a gender case study on selected Adaptation Funds projects. We have also made available the Adaptation Funds e-learning course on gender integration throughout the project life cycle. We plan to hold a gender training as part of our National Implementing Entity Seminar, which will be held next week. And we plan to conduct a gender webinar sometime in October to focusing on the updated gender guidance document. Last but not least, that we are also trying to conduct a tailored survey among the Adaptation Fund stakeholders on a regular basis to identify the needs of further gender support, as we have done when we updated our gender policy and also the gender guidance document. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Young. So please do share the links to those so that, and we will circulate, I think, all of this also in the write-up of the webinar. So thank you for sharing that. Just really to sum up from what we've heard from Young and Marijn here, that really, women are part of the solution, and not just, we're doing this just from a risk mitigation point of view. So, and there are lots of very practical steps that can be taken to do this, and so existing resources are there. But also what we've heard is this concept of intersectionality. Not all women are the same, not all men are the same. So we've got to take a more holistic view of gender as well when we're looking at conducting our gender analysis, and it goes beyond counting as well to interpreting the information, to really do a thorough gender analysis of the results of your investments. We're going to end this panel session now, but a really big thank you for the insights that you've both provided. We're going to move on now very briefly to get a few more insights from the floor, because I know there are lots of you who are on the line, and I get to pass back to Sylvie to pose the next participant question.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to panelists from our previous session. Now let's get back to the Mentimeter with some new questions for you to answer. Let me share the screen with you. For those who just join us, I remind you to connect to the Mentimeter website and use the new code that now you see on the screen. And I also copy in the chat. And so this time we have two different questions. The first one is, what type of gender consideration do you think should be integrated into Cdrfi investment and grant-making decision? For this question, you have about 1 minute to type your answer. It's an open-ended answer, so you are free to put your ideas before moving to the next question. So please, the time is open. And let's see what happens. Let's wait for some input. Access to mobile to receive payouts. Okay, so the first answer comes up. Percentage of women in leadership position of your investment portfolio companies, gender disaggregated data on beneficiaries. Okay, let's see from audience, other answer, disaggregated data. How to address gender vulnerabilities and empower women and girls. Okay. Analysis of gender differential and existing inequalities. It's another consideration to be integrated. Level of financial inclusion of women, level of digital inclusion of women and access to networks. Indigenous voices. Strengthening your women's organization to enable them to be part of local decision making. Okay. So a few moments to tap your answers. Inclusion of women voice and perspective in solution and direct financing. Well, sounds quite interesting, all this feedback from our audience. Really happy to read about that. So a few seconds and I close the time. Okay, women farmers empowerment, it's another important key consideration to be integrated. Okay, so thank you for this first question, and I will suggest to move to the next question, which is, what are the challenges in integrated gender consideration into Cdrfi investment and grant-making decisions? Again, you are 1 minute, about 1 minute to type this new answer to this question, please. Thanks. Let's see where's the first coming up. The challenges can be a little bit more complicated. Lack of knowledge on why it matters. Female representation is not equal with participation. Cdrfi is niche and complex area to integrate gender. Some organizations see gender consideration only as yet another chat box to chat. As a bot on nice to have, but it's really more than that. Great, thanks. Lack of disaggregated data, okay. Access to information we really collect. We have another one from here. Prediction on soon Cdrfi instrument will be accessible to all genders, but in fact the barriers women if as are not clear at the onset on the onset of a project. Mindset with the current insurance providers. Okay, so many feedback again for this new question. You have still a few moments, few seconds to put your ideas. No discrepancy, cultural barriers, access to pathways to empower women and underrepresented voices of women in the target local community. Not only about women, we have to get men involved. Okay, that's another important challenges. Okay, gender not considered during planning, hence left out. Okay, so the time is up. So I would like to thank you for answering both the questions and for providing this interesting input from your side. And I will now pass the floor back to Catherine for the next session, please. So thanks, Catherine. The floor is yours. Over.
Thank you very much. And really, you know, we've highlighted a lot of challenges there. And I think these are some of the challenges we're going to be hearing a little bit about in this next session as well as understanding how those who are already engaged in Cdrfi investing and grant making with a gender lens have been overcoming some of these challenges. So in this session, we're going to look at this operationalization, and we're joined by Regina Rossman from Convergence, who we heard a little bit about from Christine in our introduction today. We've got Marietta Feddersen from Blue Orchard, and also the Insure Resilience Investment Fund, IIF. And we're also joined by Ellen Brooks from British International Investment, BII. So welcome to our speakers today. So for this discussion, I think we'll start with Regina from Convergent. We heard very briefly a second ago from Christina about this investment window. Maybe could you tell us a little bit more about Convergent's gender responsive climate finance design funding window and the application criteria? So how is that
For
working?
sure, Catherine. So Convergence is the global network for blended finance, right? And as Catherine already mentioned, what we try to do in this design funding window is really see more transactions hit the market that integrate both a climate lens and a gender lens. And the Canadian government has actually been a supporter of Convergence for a long time, ever since the beginning. But with this design funding window, we really want to build out that niche in the market. And so how it works is that organizations can apply for feasibility study grants or for proof of concept grants. So if you're still at the moment where you're trying to figure out the market, you need to do a scoping exercise, or you need to do stakeholder consultations or do a gender analysis, then you may want to apply for a feasibility study grant. That's up to $190,000. But if you're already one step further and you already know this is the blended fund I want to set up and I'm targeting these women smallholder farmers in this rural area of Ethiopia or whatever, then all you may have left to do is set up the structure, pay some of the lawyers and so on. And that's when you would want to apply for a proof of concept grant. So what we really try to do with that design funding window is try to ensure that the projects that have good learnings to offer to the market and that can maybe be some of the champions that other people then look to and want to replicate, we try to support these types of projects. And how it works is that organizations apply to Convergence, and then we select and work with the applications to make sure they offer all the information that we need. We also review draft applications before the deadline and so on. And then they go through a selection process. And in the end, the grant funding comes from the government of Canada, and it flows to those organizations in order to set up those blended vehicles.
And that's great. And so actually you're really integrating both that gender and climate criteria in the choice of who you're working with. And I think what's interesting as well is, given that also Cdrfi, I mean, this is within the broader field of climate finance as well. I mean, some of these things are quite new and innovative. So actually having that proof of concept, that's really important, because if we're going to get the wider market to adopt these practices, then we need to test ideas first. And sometimes, you know, either the money's not there or it might not work. So we need to test that. That's great to hear. So what have you then found with this financing window? I mean, it's early stages yet, but what challenges and lessons learned have you been finding with this whole process? And specifically at the process where we're operating at this nexus of climate and gender together, which is quite specific and niche.
Yeah, so first, when it comes to the gender lens, we've really seen through the applications that reach us that the 2X criteria have been establishing themselves as the market standard, which is great. And I want to congratulate everybody who contributed to that, because a long way back, we already had other design funding programs, and some of them were trying to push the gender lens a little bit further, but there was no standard, right? So if people came to us, we would refer them to this CEEF tool and then to Women's World Banking and to others, but there is no one set of criteria that we could point them to. And now whenever people ask us, like, how can I read up about my gender lens? We first and foremost refer them to the 2X criteria, and we say that's the bare minimum. So if you can't tell us how you align with the 2X challenge criteria, then you're clearly not up to speed on your gender lens, right? So I think that's something that really helped us also to give more guidance and tell people where to look. So I think that's been really interesting, and we see that by now most of the applications actually do that proactively, so we don't even have to tell them where to go anymore. They somehow found the criteria either because an investor told them to or an advisor told them to, right? So a lot of times in the applications they already mention how they align with the 2X criteria. So I think that's great. One challenge that we see is that this integration of both the gender and the climate lens can be an issue for some applicants. And that's just natural because gender and climate lenses require very different skill sets, right? So one organization may have all the gender knowledge and they may very well be able to outline how their gender assessments will work and what the metrics are they are tracking on the gender front. But then they may have very limited understanding of the climate related metrics. And then we have the other thing too, like we see climate related organizations who apply and they just brush over the gender stuff in one paragraph and then talk like for pages about the climate impact. And so it's really tough to find proposals that have both lenses really strongly affected. We see a lot of times when we have consortiums of organizations, whereby you have like a climate organization leading and then a gender consulting firm, or the other way around, you have a gender asset manager leading and then they had some climate expertise coming from an NGO or whatever. That's when we see that both lenses are really strongly represented. And then the last point I'd like to mention is we've really seen a very strong need for this type of design funding in the market. So in the very first cycle, so when we first had our first application deadline, we received 27 final proposals and we awarded 1 design grant to Sun Funder. And this time round, last week we had a deadline actually, and we received 41 final proposals, which is 50% more than the first time round. So it really shows that there is a realization in the market that we need to work on these 2 fronts, gender and climate, and there is a need for more grants like that, like from the Canadian government. So I think that's a really positive sign for us.
That's fantastic to hear. And, you know, when you talk about this need for both gender expertise and climate expertise, and now today we're talking about Cdrfi, so that's actually climate finance specifically, and that's kind of an insurance expertise. It's just this sort of narrowing, isn't it, of this expertise that's needed. But thank you. That actually brings us really nicely onto what Marietta's doing from Blue Orchard, and Blue Orchard manage the Insure Resilience Investment Fund, and that is very specific to Cdrfi. So maybe Marietta, could you possibly introduce us to the IAF and the commitments that you've got? I understand we've heard about the 2X challenge and those commitments. Maybe could you let us know a little bit about the commitments you've made there, and what kind of gender strategies you're applying with the fund as well, please?
Yes, thanks, Katarina. First, thanks for including Blue Orchard into this talk today. And yeah, maybe briefly on introducing the Insure Resilience Investment Fund, in short IAF. It's an impact investment fund that was created by the German Development Bank, acting on behalf of the Development Ministry. And the objective really is to contribute to the adaptation of climate change by improving access to insurance products in developing countries. And the very specific objective is to reduce the vulnerability of small businesses and low-income households to extreme weather events. And the fund itself is comprised of kind of 2 sub-funds. It has a debt fund that invests into the financial sector, so banks and microfinance institutions offer insurance products, but also with our equity sub-funds, we can take direct equity stakes in insurance companies who either serve clients in ODA countries or themselves situated in such countries. And in addition to this investment arm, we also have some grant facilities. We can do technical assistance with our investees, and we also have a bit of a luxury. We also have a grant where we can do premium support, so we can reduce premium payments on a short-term basis, so that we can bring more clients into testing and see the value of climate insurance. So that's really IIF in a nutshell. Now on the fund's commitment to the 2X challenge. And it's interesting because the fund was there first, and then at some point, some investors realized, oh, we actually aren't complying with, some important criteria of 2X. So let's look into this. So first of all, we saw that we were in compliance with one of the 5 criteria, which is consumption. So we have been addressing really a problem where women were disproportionately impacted. As all I believe here know, is that really, there's so many effects on women displacement through climate change, and a high level of women labor force in developing countries that work in sectors that are negatively affected by climate change. So with kind of our offer with the insurance products, we figured that we are actually addressing these problems. And we did have data to show that more than half of the clients that we were serving were actually women. So yeah, we were responding to this aspect, and since then, we have paid kind of more, let's say, strategic attention to this gender lens within this fund. Although we have been addressing kind of gender topics across the funds at Blue Orchard. For this fund, we are well, on the one side, as a very general activity in our composition of the portfolio, we have an ESG questionnaire. Of course, we have a range of questions really related to women and gender topics. And then also we look at the impact of the company. Is there any impact specifically related to gender? Of course, we give higher scores, the higher we see an impact is, and the higher a company responds positively to gender questions. And then we really were pushing for getting sex disaggregated data for more and more investors, because it seems to be easier for financial institutions to have these data, but sometimes when we work with insurance companies who are part of the insurance value chain and provide services to the sector that are not used to disaggregating their data, it's a bit more challenging.
Yeah. And so just tell me, you've made an investment in Cdrfi investee, as it were. What investment is that? Is it cash in Pakistan or something? Maybe could you just give us a brief 1 minute on them, and then we'll move on to hear about what we're hearing from Ellen as well. So please go ahead.
Yes, exactly. So that it's an investee in our debt sub fund. So it's a non-bank financial institution in Pakistan, and they are per se focused on women. So they only serve women clients, and they have a strong focus on serving women farmers. And they have a loan product for cattle, and this product is combined with an insurance product. So in the event when a cattle falls ill or dies, then the insurance kicks in, and the women farmer can receive a payout and go buy, for example, new cattle. And here's of course a very close link this is Cdrfi, right? The cattle insurance is really especially important in the face of climate change, because we have seen that adverse events such as drought and flooding and disease really seem to be negatively affecting the livestock mortality rates. So we wanted to understand this further, and then back in 2020, we implemented a survey with a selection of 120 clients of cash, and to understand what effect did the product have. And it was interesting first to see that in fact 2/3 of the client respondents had experienced a negative climate shock, and then out of those who had experienced that shock and had this insurance, those who have been asking for a payout of the insurance premium had could recover to their pre-shock levels at a much faster rate. So we could see that this insurance really helped them to get back on track after they were hit by a negative climate event.
That's fantastic, and it shows the importance really of gathering data as well, and having that as part of your system. Maybe we'll move on now to Ellen and the work that you're doing at BII and your approach to integrating sort of this gender considerations into climate financing. I understand it's not Cdrfi that you focus on, but it's sort of more broader than that. So how did you go about building this business case internally, and what are you doing to bring these themes together in your investments? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I think both the Mentimeter questions and responses and the interventions by previous panelists have shown just how much sort of knowledge there is on this call and interest in the intersectionality between climate and gender. So if I just add a few points on how we're operationalizing this at BII and share from that experience, I think that firstly, we are the UK's development finance institution. So we invest in private sector businesses across South Asia and Africa in both sort of funds of funds model, but also direct investments, and that includes financial institutions. We have a climate finance target and a gender finance target. And so the work that I've been doing with my gender colleagues, because I'm in the climate team, has really been to bring those together. And so we're actively looking to sort of source and originate deals which have gender or climate impact, and really explore where we can deepen that, the nexus. I think your first session and your presentation, Catherine, really highlighted the first place that we started. It was that definition of gender smart climate finance. What does that mean? We were struggling with that. And I think with the work that BII has done with the 2X Collaborative, we've made real progress there. And so we see that kind of investment as one which is climate finance qualified, and we use the MDB taxonomy for that, and one which meets the 2X criteria. And then when we have an investment which overlaps on both of those, then we really work together across our different teams, so climate and gender team, to think about how to deepen that nexus. And that's, I mean, we've been doing this proactively for probably about a year to 18 months. So we still got some way to go. We've got a lot to learn, but we have been able to deliver a lot of gender smart climate finance. We'll be talking about that at COP27. We've got interesting examples from across sectors. And so I think this is something that we need to scale much more quickly. And I think key learnings I could share with others on the call is about having that definition, about working collaboratively with colleagues. I've had to really upskill on gender colleagues have had to upskill on climate. I think you're never going to have one person who can do all of it, and that's okay. We need to cross-pollinate and collaborate. And then really your question went to the business case, which I don't have time to go into huge amounts of detail on now, but at the 2X Green Toolkit, which was mentioned earlier, we've pulled together cases for the business and impact case across different sectors, but also by themes. And so highly relevant today is the adaptation note, which we can link out to, but that really does go into some of the emerging evidence for why, when you're investing with an adaptation finance lens, women are so important. I think the vulnerability point is key, and so is their role as drivers of change, and particularly as a climate finance person, understanding gender differentiated, I guess, impacts of climate change is like absolutely essential when you're thinking about deploying adaptation finance.
I think that comes actually to sort of a follow-up question as a real challenge and maybe an opportunity for you when you're actually integrating these gender considerations specifically. I mean, what do you see as the challenge, you know, when it comes to applying, say, the 2X criteria, for instance, and getting sex disaggregated data? Maybe you could elaborate on that briefly.
Yeah, and maybe if I elaborated a bit around adaptation finance in particular, we do have one example of climate insurance as well, which I'd be very happy to speak to, although still some more work to do on gender, I think, there. But we are working with lots of other DFIs in the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative to really understand how to deliver more private sector adaptation finance, which I think is a market that really needs catalyzing and accelerating. One of the adaptation finance investments we made last year and announced at COP26 is Pooler, which is an agri-tech parametric insurance product operating in East Africa. It does pay harvest climate insurance for smallholder farmers. And so we are really upskilling and deploying more adaptation finance. This is already an incredibly difficult thing for a DFI to do. Adaptation finance impact metrics are something that the collaborative is actively working on. And so to your point around metrics, we also need to, at the same time as we're upskilling on how to do that part, also think about how to overlay that gender disaggregated lens on those metrics that we're collecting. And we also need to bring in gender colleagues to help us write sort of adaptation plans which are suitable for private sector businesses and private sector investments. And so I think those are the opportunities I see for us to do more of this going forward.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. So maybe just we'll just go one last round to each of you very briefly for a few minutes, and just I guess picking up on some of the themes that we've been hearing. The selection, Regina, of who you're working with, you know, especially if it's so new, it must be really difficult. So can you tell us about how you go about the actual selection process of this climate finance and gender window, and how you've been integrating gender within that, if you know these practices are so new for these organisations?
For sure. So we found that the most important step is actually before the applicants submit the final application, because once the application is in, there's very little things you can do in order to make it better, right? So what we found is that the best approach is to already engage with applicants before they submit the application, review their concept notes, give them some comments, tell them where we need more information, so that by the time they submit the final application, it has all the information we want. And we also need to recognize that not all organizations will be very good at writing about what they're about to do. That doesn't mean they don't know how to do it, right? So just because somebody's not an English native doesn't mean that his proposal is bad. It just means that he needs some more support in putting it together. So I think that's one of the key learnings, is to start early on. And already in the application template, we ask things like for them to describe the team and how many of their team members are female versus male and so on. So we can already integrate some of the gender considerations in the application template, and we can make sure we collect the relevant information on gender lens. And then once we have the final application, then it really comes down to probing and making sure we actually have enough evidence for some of the stuff you write, because you can write a whole lot of things in an application, right? And we all know we tweak our things to be most suitable to the type of money we are trying to attract. And so in the due diligence process, for example, we really look into whether people have just written down some metrics that they Googled, or whether they are actually trying to collect these gender disaggregated metrics, for example. So that's another thing that I think is really important, because in the end, once you sign an agreement, yes, sure, there is milestones, so you can still tie the disbursement of money to achieving certain things, but you have very little leeway, right, at the moment when you signed the grant. So a lot of the work actually has to happen before.
Really helpful, and but it's what's happening before, but it's also working through it, that whole of the process as well, you've said. So looking at it in your due diligence, verifying the information that's there, and then also post investment continuing that too. Marietta, how are you working then in terms of integrating these gender considerations sort of across the investment process itself? So you've chosen your investee, you've kind of seen that they're looking at Cdrfi, they're looking at gender, but how do you continue integrating those gender considerations, including at sort of the impact evaluation stage, and what kind of lessons learned have you got from how you're going about?
Yeah, so you said, I mean, if we are at this stage to already work with an investee, there's been a lot of work done already. So of course, all the questions along the identification process as part of the investment memo preparation, we do look very deeply into gender topics, and we have long questions and analysis that we do, and kind of we see that it pays out. So it pays out specifically for IIF, because there we have this focus on kind of more the technical side, on the insurance product and industry. And if we have all these questions on the gender side, right, it means we can really narrow in on kind of the right partners where we have a combination of the two topics. And of course, there's also a lot of things that we don't see, as you said. I mean, at some point we're closing the investment, we are working with a partner where we have seen either already good results or a clear intent to work towards gender topics. But of course, at some point we lose a bit of, we don't lose visibility, but there is a reporting that we receive from investees on their clients. But we would want to understand certainly more the impact level, kind of what does it mean that clients have access to this specific insurance product. So what we do, I mean, there's two things we can do. First, we can kind of actively intervene with our technical assistance, so we can really kind of work with the institutions and tell them, look, don't you find there might be some opportunities to look into specific needs of women? Or we can, if we do market studies, already look for some opportunities and offer them. So that's something we only have started now. And we have impact studies that we do every 5 years on this fund. So we have done one in 2020 where we have looked, among others, into the client base of Cash Foundation. And the next comes again in 2025. And here again, we have already a list of questions that we would want to pose to investees to dig even deeper into exactly this nexus of, offering climate insurance to women and what does it mean to their lives.
And I guess it's what does it mean to their lives, both immediately in terms of getting that payout, but then also over the longer term as well. And I think that this is really the challenge when we start talking about Cdrfi, sort of the insurance, is that actually it's not just the immediate impact. You've got the insurance, you've got the coverage, and you get a payout in the short term, but what actually happens over the longer term, and has it really built resilience? And that's much more difficult when we start getting to the measurement and having that disaggregated data, also depending on where women are in sort of the value chain. So thank you for sharing that, and we'll really be looking forward to seeing the results of that impact study when it happens. Ellen, with you've got an approach where you've also been investing sort of internally within the organisation at BII and setting up structures and putting resources, human and otherwise, sort of in place to really implement BII's commitments to gender lens investing, because you've got these very concrete specific goals and targets that you've set. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the internal structures that you've set up to support gender lens investing in your climate finance and vice versa?
Yeah, of course. I think it's a really good question. So I think I mentioned the importance of, firstly, the definition for gender lens climate finance, because that really helps us mainstream across the organization and align on that we're talking about the same thing. So that's been key. And then we have then been able to set targets for how much climate and gender finance we're delivering. So separate, but that allows us to also map the nexus. That has really focused attention, I think, across the organization and enabled collaboration between, we sort of have an impact group who look at sort of the ESG and the impact side of our investments and our investment teams. That's brought all of us together around one common goal. And then we've really moved into what sort of is the capacity building that we need to upskill on that. So we have set up, and the gender team actually run these different working groups for different investment products on what a gender lens in that investment product looks like. And they meet regularly, and we build capacity through that. On top of that, we regularly link into the 2X communities, communities of practice and other training. We're one of the founding members of 2X, and so we've drawn a lot from that. And then I think the third thing is that we are, particularly on this nexus of investments in gender and climate, there's a core group of us who are piloting some approaches on those investments and are really taking that more like innovative lens. And I think when we have the outcomes of those investments, I loved what you were saying, Marietta, about impact studies and tracking the results of those. I think when we have that, then in another year to 18 months, we might be in the position where we could scale that out to a broader approach across the rest of our investments. So I think it's having clarity, targets and structures, capacity building, and then thinking about which is sort of the low-hanging fruit or the first investments that you want to take a really intentional approach to the climate gender nexus in.
You know, I think that is the word, intentional, isn't it? You know, at the moment, some of what is being done isn't perhaps always intentional, and what we're seeing is really through the practices that you're all implementing now is this move towards an intentional gender lens. It's not just about collecting sex disaggregated data just because it just happens to be within the M&E system. You're collecting it intentionally with a purpose to use it. What we've heard about here is around, you know, setting targets, being clear on our definitions, bringing skills together, both the climate knowledge, the adaptation knowledge, but also that gender expertise and Cdrf expertise in one, and realizing you've got to work in partnership. I'm hearing across teams, across groups of people with different expertise. It might be with other organizations who are active in this space, and this real role for sort of peer learning as well. The fact that you know, what you're sharing even today, but through the 2X collaborative and the work that you all seem to be doing with them, you've been able to share experiences and the importance of capturing learning as well, because we're all learning as we're on this journey, and some of the experiences from the broader climate finance and adaptation finance and applying a gender lens are actually just as applicable for Cdrfi as well. So really, with that, I'd like to say a massive thank you to you all for sharing your experiences and insights. We will be capturing and sharing this, and please do continue to share any links that you think those who are on the call today might be interested in reading up on and using for their own work. I'm going to turn now to my colleague Jana to see some of the questions that we've been getting in the chat, and whether we can perhaps answer some of them in the remaining time that we've got now. So thank you to our panelists, and Jana, any questions that have been emerging on the chat, please?
Yes, Sylvia, when you can activate my video, I can also, people can also see me again. Perfect, I see that it's starting. Yes, we got some really great questions. So just to summarize them, I have 3 questions in front of me. First, I think Yang, you already talked a little bit about examples. There was the question of how does the Adaptation Fund undertake the process to ensure gender integration? For example, do you have a pool of experts who review proposals or gender appraisal checklists? Any specific examples that show good gender results, like on best practices? I think you touched upon some, if you want to add on this. And then we had 2 very yeah, I think questions that you could also really discuss and talk lengthily about. So, for example, in summary, how to actually convince risk modeling companies and insurers to include gender considerations. So, because we see that that sometimes they do like risk modeling and support Cdrfi investment, but they don't believe it is actually their role to consider gender, right? And then the last question that came up was, what are actually the advantages and disadvantages of focusing on gender rather than having a broader commitment to the inclusion of also age, disability, ethnicity, and other factors that are very important to include the most vulnerable in strategies? And do you imagine that gender is kind of a door opener to start with these strategies? And I saw that Regina already touched upon this question, but Catherine or the rest of the panel, if you have something to say on this, I would also be super interested, because it's highly also complicated, but great to discuss it in this panel.
Thank you, Jana. And what I can refer you all to, if you haven't seen it, there was a publication that Insure Resilience partnered with the Insurance Development Forum, IDF, which looks at development impact of risk analytics, and that actually does look a little bit at this risk modelling topic, but certainly there seems to be a role there. Maybe on the risk modelling point, first of all, would any of you like to come in on that? In the different angles that you can look at it, also the participation of women as risk modelers as well as the data. Ellen, I think you've unmuted yourself. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can't specifically speak to risk modelling, but I think what I would like to add, and we found really effective, is that consumption criteria of the 2x criteria. So who is going to be using and purchasing the insurance product that you are looking to sell? The stats around like 80% of the world's purchasing decisions are driven by women. We know that smallholder farmers, for example, are so often female and might be sort of underserved in terms of financial inclusion. So I think that we know there's a risk case for women are more highly impacted by climate change, but there is this kind of other side of the coin, which is selling into women is an untapped market, and profitable businesses over the next century or half century will be tapping into that opportunity. So I'd encourage people to look at the opportunity lens.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on any of these three questions? So we've got the risk modelling, we've got looking at Young specifically. There was a question to yourself around the how-to of gender integration, and then there's also the point about the advantages of focusing on gender specifically rather than looking at other intersectional factors with a very specific lens?
Sure, that's a great question. For the adaptation fund, that basically by integrating gender considerations as requirements into the funding as a funding requirement. So we make sure that those the gender considerations are incorporated into funding proposal, which I mentioned it without the articulate justification of gender considerations. The board will not approve the funding decision. And also for gender responsive monitoring and evaluation, the implementing entity is required to submit those performance report annually and evaluation report. And what else? That we provide the funding support for gender and try to enhance the awareness on gender. Nothing is, I mean, there's no fits for all solution, and we fully understand also we have to recognize that we are working with the developing countries where the gender context is very different. So that's why rather than we set the or how should I say, the most ideal gender goals, we try to set the minimum standards and criteria so that implementing entities or the developing countries can meet the minimum standards, so can access the funding. But also that we don't stop there. We also at the same time trying to promote further proactive gender responsive measures. And that's what we've seen, that our implementing entities have gone further than the minimum requirements of gender responsive measures. On another question on that's very interesting question. And we've actually considered a lot that point, the advantages and disadvantages of focusing on gender, just the gender, or the focusing gender as just a part of other interconnected factors. And we had a lot of debate, and what we propose from the gender perspective, and there are different perspectives about the intersectionality. However, what we try to propose is that putting the gender at the center of the intersectionality, because we do not want to see gender is diluted as just a part of those relevant socio-economic interconnected contexts. So that's what we propose, the intersectionality in the gender, in the updated funds gender policy. And as Emily indicated correctly, I believe that there are advantages and disadvantages of focusing just on one gender. However, we believe that our proposal was that by applying the intersectional approaches, we could deepen the gender assessment, gender analysis, by not just looking at the vulnerable community, vulnerable people, not just as a binary approach, men and women, but we look into the deeper interconnected context by considering age, disability, ethnicity, and all other factors. Hope that's helpful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Final remarks maybe from Regina, and then a final remark from Marietta after that, before we then move on to our closing remarks. Regina, any reflections from your side? Thank you.
Thanks. I'd really want to emphasize the point that I think gender, amongst all the issues that we have around diversity, is the one that right now has the broadest support. And I think that's why it makes sense to start with that, because if we can get some of the private investors and insurance companies to comply on that front, then it's not that much further to include other diversity indicators as well. But we got to start somewhere. And I think they would be mostly very overwhelmed if we try to say, and by the way, you also have to comply with this, that, and this, and this, and this. So let's take it one step at a time.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to that 50% women versus 50% men, and you start getting to subgroups if you start looking at some of the other characteristics. Thank you, Regina. And Marietta, some closing words from yourself.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, something that came to my mind when listening to these questions and comments is that, I mean, we have been working with one institution, as I mentioned, Cash. One institution where we found is exactly serving this nexus. But there were still many things to be done. So women were accessing these loans, but sometimes they weren't aware of the value of them, and they didn't go back and ask for the repayment, and hence couldn't benefit from the insurance. So kind of even if everything is out there and put in place, there's still a lot of kind of attention needed really until the last mile, until the last client, the female client, to know what they should be doing to really kind of harness the value of whatever instrument is offered to them. So that's also very important.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And I think we've had one more question come up in the chat, and I'll just refer to it, which is around the role of the regulator in getting sex disaggregated data. And are there any regulators, that insurance supervisors, that are doing that? If you look at a publication by A2II, the Access to Insurance Initiative, who's a partner organisation working with the Insure Resilience on the insurance, working with insurance supervisors on training, what you will find is that there is a list of those regulators that do require sex disaggregated data, and so that's a useful source for you to look at. And as investors, you can work with your regulators and insurance supervisors in getting some of that data as well from the insurance companies within that value chain. At this point, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of you for the insights shared. I'm going to pass back now to Christina to provide some final remarks as we close, but thank you everybody from my side.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and a really, really big thank you to all of the panelists for their interventions today. I think as I was reflecting on the input, I was really pleased to hear about the stress that was placed on the importance of providing leadership opportunities and participatory opportunities to both women and girls. And it was noted earlier that, you know, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change. And they often face, obviously, you know, issues to access when accessing productive resources, but they're also part of the solution. It's really important that, you know, we don't just frame them as victims, but also as contributors and leaders to finding a solution. I think often, you know, a lot of people often get stuck on the how do we do it. And, you know, it was mentioned in one of the discussion questions that the barriers to gender equality in Cdrfi aren't always necessarily clear, and that you know, gender experts are not necessarily climate experts. So it's why I think this community and this collaboration is essential to share that knowledge and those lessons learned. And I think hearing from both the participants and the audience will only help to strengthen this work. And I'd therefore like to thank everyone for joining us today, and of course to PharmD and the Insure Resilience Global Partnership for organizing this webinar today. Thank you so much again, and everyone have a great rest of your day. I also forgot to mention, sorry, there are, I think it was perhaps shared in the chat, but there's the details of the publication. I'm not sure if it's possible to share the link again. Jana, and yes, also I just wanted to send a friendly reminder. I understand that there will be an evaluation poll that's sent after the webinar, so we'd encourage you to fill that out if possible. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.